Hello everybody and welcome to this Life Technologies recorded webinar session on the development of a next generation global multiplex. My name is Nicola Oldroyd. I'm a consultant forensic scientist with Life Technologies and I will be your host for this session. A brief outline of what we'll be discussing. I'll start with a little bit of history regarding the evolution of our application-specific solutions for forensic analysis, a process that started with the modifier kit and has led up to the development of our latest products, the GlobalFiler Kits, which will be the main topic of conversation during this session. With regards to the GlobalFiler Kits themselves, I'll talk a little bit about the design of those systems, show some examples of the performance that we've been obtaining in collaboration with our test sites, and also discuss some of the other infrastructure support that might be needed for the new chemistry, such as the new data collection and data analysis software development that are accompanying them. So let's start with that history and a little bit of a look back at how we've evolved application-specific solutions for forensic analysis. If we look back round about a decade and take ourselves back to 2001, applied biosystems chemistries at the time revolved around a one-size-fits-all approach, where one kit was designed to do both casework and databasing applications within the forensic laboratory. The identifier kit was the last of these types of chemistries that we developed, but it was the first single amplification multiplex to cover all 13 CODIS core loci. Quite a challenge at the time with the technology developments as they were to get all of those loci working effectively for both casework and databasing. If we move on to 2007, we knew by now that we needed to take a specific look at how to address some of the most challenging samples encountered by the forensic laboratories. And for this, we developed the modifier kit, an enhanced assay for particularly challenging samples containing either high levels of inhibition or particularly degraded DNA. This was the first commercially available system to employ mini STR loci exclusively to improve performance on degraded samples, and it allowed us to experiment with new buffer chemistry to allow us to overcome inhibition in the sample. This was the start of our application-specific approach, and by 2009 we decided to take the experience we had with modifier and the new experiences we had with buffer chemistry development to take a look at how we could more specifically address the single source samples processed by the forensic laboratory. Normally these samples are in high numbers and need to be processed quickly, so it made sense to take a look at how we might be able to improve the efficiency of the single source sample workflow, and to do this we developed the Identifier Direct Kit. And this was the first commercially available multiplex to perform direct amplification from unpurified single-source samples, either blood or buccal, on paper substrates. The beauty of this is that it eliminates the extraction, purification, and, in some cases, quantification steps performed by the laboratory for those single-source samples, significantly reducing the amount of time to achieve a result and also hopefully reducing the cost implications for the laboratory. By 2010, we needed chemistries to partner with the direct amplification systems for single-source amplification, and we moved on to looking at how we could better improve the robustness and the sensitivity and the overall performance of chemistries for casework. To accompany the Identifier Direct Kit, we developed the Identifier Plus Kit, a high-performance version of the same marker set with much greater capability to perform on inhibited samples, and then to encompass the loci required for the European standard set of loci, we developed the NGM Select kit, again a large-scale multiplex with that performance for casework samples. The developments, however, didn't stop there, and by the early part of this year, we've developed an standard and improved application-specific sample processing capabilities with the NGM Select Express kit. This takes all of the developments of the previous 10 years, builds on them, and culminates in the first commercially available fast and direct amplification system to not only maximize the efficiency of that single source workflow with direct amplification, but with amplification times of now round about 45 minutes, the time to result has been reduced significantly. In fact, it's almost possible to get a result in 2 hours on standard current workflows using this chemistry. So what the last 10 years has taught us is that it's going to be very, very difficult to get the same type of chemistry performing to maximum efficiency on single source samples, but also to maximum robustness and performance on casework samples. And so for us, it's made sense to split the development streams of these different chemistries so that we don't have to compromise the performance of any one application within the laboratory. We can have the high-performance chemistries for casework applications which do not compromise on quality, which maintain the levels of performance and specificity that forensic laboratories need to have confidence in their casework sample interpretation. The Identifiler Plus, NGM and NGM Select kits are prime examples of these, where we have been able to improve significantly the information recovery from even the most challenging samples obtained by the laboratory. On the other hand, we're able to have high throughput chemistries for single source applications. For these, we can alter the buffer chemistry to get maximum efficiency, to get maximum performance on unpurified samples without the need for the long and complex workflow traditionally associated with casework samples. The Identifiler Direct and NGM Select Express kits allow us to maximize that time to result, allowing us, as I mentioned, to get to a result in under 2 hours. But where does all this leave us when we think about the new global multiplex systems? And particularly for the rest of this session, I'm going to be focusing on the GlobalFiler Kits, which are our answer to the requirements being raised by the international community for a combination STR system that can hopefully link together all of the different international recommendations for different loci sets. There are a lot of questions as to why a global multiplex system might be required. Obviously, the new CODIS recommendations put out by the United States have galvanized us in terms of developing a new system, but there have been many new recommendations developed over the last few years, all of which have culminated together to bring forward the idea of a global, more comprehensive STR multiplex system. The European standard set of loci was expanded in 2009, and there are an increasing number of laboratories looking at missing persons investigations, and for that they require more loci to help resolve difficult types of cases, particularly involving related individuals. So it's very clear why we need to develop such a multiplex. We need to increase international data compatibility as more and more countries look to share their information. We need to increase the discrimination power so that particularly for missing persons investigations or disaster victim identification, we have the power that we need to make those cases easier to unravel. And also, as databases become larger, we need to reduce the likelihood of adventitious matches, which may mean that samples not from the same individual actually throw up the same profile simply by chance. And how are we going to do this? Well, it's very simple to say. We increase the number of loci and we incorporate loci contained in global databases. But when you look at the number of loci which are now contained in those databases, combining all of those into a single multiplex system is associated with a few challenges. So for those of you that may not be aware of the updated CODIS core loci recommendations, it was originally published in April of 2011, and there are a couple of little changes compared to the LOCUS recommendations which have been available up until that point. The new recommendation drops the LOCUS TPOX from the list of required loci, downgrading it to simply a highly recommended LOCUS. Probably quite understandable because TPOX is not the most powerful of loci, and in the newer loci which have been incorporated into other international databases, there are stronger, more powerful loci to choose from. The new list of required loci includes all the markers from the NGM Select and Identifiler series kits, so all of the markers currently recommended by the US and also by the European forensic community. In addition, there were some other loci included, in particular a YSTR marker that you can see down here, DYS391, and this one is already included in the YFiler kit. Now, following the original recommendation publication in April of 2011, an update to that was published in January of 2012, where two of the loci on the original list, Penta-E and Penta-D, were removed from the list of CODIS core loci, leaving the remainder of the loci intact. At the time of the recommendation, and in light of the other expansion of international standard sets, such as that conducted by the European forensic community, we started to talk to laboratories about their concerns around potentially building such a large and complex multiplex system. And on the screen you can see just some of the feedback that we obtained during some of those interviews with operational forensic laboratories around the concerns that they had about the potential compromises that might need to be made with such a complex system. Probably one of the most common was that with so many loci, isn't there a risk of losing sensitivity and having more dropout? This is obviously of concern to laboratories because in recent years we have been able to improve the levels of sensitivity and decrease the levels of dropout that laboratories see. And of course they don't want to go back to the days of only getting poor quality partial profiles from some of their most difficult samples. So maintaining the levels of performance we've begun to see over the last few years is obviously of paramount importance. Also, labs are often dealing with more low-level trace and touch type samples, and analysis of these can already be difficult, especially with mixtures. And with even more loci, there is the concern that that difficulty could increase exponentially. So not only do we need to think about the overall performance of the system, we also need to try to make it as simple and straightforward to interpret as we can. There has been some questions around the inclusion of a YSTR marker in the system because this would be the first time that systems containing both autosomal and haplotype markers would be combined in the same system. Some laboratories haven't been entirely certain as to why that's needed, particularly as amylogenin is already present as a gender determination locus in most STR kits, and if you're using a quantitation system that also includes the Y probe, you would of course have confirmation of the gender of your sample. So we need to take a look at why that might be valuable, and given why it might be valuable, how to incorporate additional gender determination markers in the best possible way to achieve the desired result. And ultimately, whenever a new system is coming on stream, the question of budget is always very large in the thoughts of the forensic laboratory. Many labs are already facing big backlogs, and also with the current economic climate, budget shortfalls are common. So potentially having to purchase and implement a new instrument platform to run a new chemistry would be an enormous hurdle. So we need to make sure that we can make any new system as compatible with all of our instrument platforms as we can. So the goals of the development project for this new global STR multiplex are really quite simple. We absolutely have to maximize information recovery from challenging samples and generate what we believe is the most robust and the most discrimination kit available to the forensic community. And the way to do this will be to leverage new dyes, to expand the available space and incorporate additional markers. And through doing this, we'll be able to meet the objectives of all the international loci working groups and ensure that this kit is as internationally compatible as it can be. But to do this, there are some challenges, mainly associated with the multiplexing of large numbers of small amplicon STR loci. If you look at the current 5-die format used for some of our other chemistries, there is insufficient space to accommodate large numbers of similarly sized amplicons in that current format. And the last thing we want to do is increase the size of any of those markers, because regardless of how good the buffer system is, a long marker is far more vulnerable to degradation, and we don't want to run the risk of losing markers to degradation, which is very difficult to overcome once it's happened. We have access to a variety of technology that allows us to ensure that the configurations of our chemistries are as optimal as they can be. One of those pieces of technology are mobility modifiers, which allow us to space out the amplicons within the electropherogram for optimal spacing and better ease of genotyping. However, as with all technology, there are limitations regarding how much you can use, and we need to balance just how many of those mobility modifiers we choose to use, because whilst they are a very valuable tool, if we use too many of them, they can also make the system quite difficult to use and potentially compromise the performance, and that's something that we weren't willing to accept. Ideally, we also want to incorporate expanded marker ranges into the system, because marker ranges have expanded over the years with the profiling of greater numbers of different types of population samples. But again, because of the limited space within the system, there could be limited space between adjacent markers, and we need to find a way to space those out as best as we can. There are also challenges associated with balancing the needs of casework and single-source applications. For single-source sample applications, efficiency tends to be the watchword. Laboratories want to get those samples through the process with the minimum amount of time and resources expended. But for casework, the watchword is robustness, and we need to make sure that we maintain the levels of performance, if not even improve the levels of performance that we've been able to achieve with our other next generation systems, and make sure that we don't compromise between the two different types of applications, single source and casework. For single source samples, high throughput also tends to be a goal, whereas for casework, low to medium throughput is normally acceptable because the laboratories are fine with spending a little bit more time on those samples to ensure they get absolutely the right result. And for single source samples, expert systems are becoming increasingly common, again to reduce the amount of time spent at the data analysis stage, which can often be a bottleneck. For casework, a much more manual analysis regime is often needed because it requires the expertise of the analyst to conduct the interpretation successfully. So when you look at all those challenges, building such a multiplex system, whilst it might sound simple on paper, does actually pose a number of challenges to the development team. So one of the ways we've monitored how we've gone about producing these systems and making sure that we've hit all of the key development goals that we have, we've developed a project checklist. At the top of the list is the overall goal. We need to develop a single multiplex configuration that meets both international data sharing requirements and, probably even more importantly, the performance needs of forensic laboratories. And during the course of the rest of this session, I'll be going through each of these in turn and highlighting how we've made some design decisions and optimized the system to be able to meet all of these goals. And first on the list is to produce separate kits for database and casework applications. So very much in line with the development strategy that we've taken over the last few years, the GlobalFiler Kits is a suite of chemistries designed to meet the needs of all the applications within the forensic laboratory. The GlobalFiler PCR amplification kit is the high-performance chemistry for casework, and in order to make sure we can maintain those performance goals, we need to put this into the 6-die format. The GlobalFiler Express PCR amplification kit is its partner, an ultra-high throughput, again 6-die chemistry for single source samples to allow us to get those through the laboratory processes quickly and efficiently. Now, we often get questions as to why do we take this 2-kit strategy as opposed to trying to have one system which could do all of the applications and make the implementation burden on the laboratory just that little bit easier. Well, we've actually done a lot of work on the performance of different types of systems and looking at how we can maximize both the efficiency for single source and the performance for casework. And unfortunately, what tends to happen is if you optimize for efficiency, you do start to compromise some of the critical casework metrics that you would measure a system by when you're looking at it on your samples. For example, in order to get the high throughput and in order to get the capacity to deal with unpurified samples for a direct amplification system, what can sometimes happen is that from a casework perspective, your specificity might start to drop a little bit. Now, for a single source sample, that is not an issue because they're generally single source and from a human DNA sample. That means you don't really have to worry about contamination with exogenous sources of DNA, for example, from domestic animals. However, in casework, you have no idea of the source of that sample, and you need to make sure that the specificity is absolutely true to human DNA as much as is possible, given the limitations of the types of markers that we use, to make sure that we're not going to see cross-reactivity levels with domestic or agricultural species that could interfere with the interpretation of a casework system. So that's just one example as to why we believe it's better not to make that compromise, to take the chemistries down their specific workflow so that we can develop performance for casework and efficiency for single source. And that way, the laboratory gets absolutely the best quality result. It's true, it may take slightly longer to validate the system up front if you do have 2 chemistries to utilize. However, the savings and the benefit for the workflow and the samples that you have within that laboratory will more than repay any slight extra time spent at validation. And given that we also have the services of our professional services team who can take on some of that validation burden, the implementation and validation of the systems may not be quite as extensive as you might imagine. So that's an easy one to check off. We know that we need to go down these separate routes to get those performance advantages, and so we separate the kits for database and casework applications. The next challenge is to incorporate all of the loci which are on the databases internationally. And this is just an overview of some of the loci in common use internationally on those DNA databases. And you can see it's now a very long list of loci. And really the core goal is if we can incorporate all of the loci on the new CODIS proposals, we will incorporate the majority of the other locker sets internationally, because the CODIS recommendations reflect the advances in locker set decisions that have been taken by other international jurisdictions over the last few years. Now, when it comes to incorporating these loci into our chemistries, we are in a very fortunate position because all of them are already contained in either the Identifiler series or NGM Select kits for the autosomal loci, and the YSTR locus DYS391 is included in our YFiler kit. Now, one of the benefits that we have of maintaining our primer sequences over the years, for example, if we take a look back to 1996 when we released our very first small STR multiplex, the primer sequences utilized for the FGA, VWA, and D3 loci in that system have been maintained throughout the last 15 years. And what that means is we have a lot of information about the performance of those markers, but it also means that our loci sit in the same places in all of the multiplex systems we build. So there's very little overlap between any of these markers, and we can just slot them into a system, hopefully as easily as possible. Keeping our primer sequences the same has always been at the core of our design decisions, mainly because we want to maximize concordance. Now again, there's always a lot of discussion around how big an issue concordance is, and with small databases and small data sets, concordance is not generally a very large issue. But as international databases continue to grow and the number of samples on those databases continues to increase, the risk of non-concordance actually also increases. And so for us, we believe that in the long term, we will minimize any issues with interpretation for the laboratory by ensuring that we keep our primer sequences as consistent as possible. And even with the design of such a complex system as the GlobalFiler Kits, we have been able to do this. With the exception of TPOX, the GlobalFiler Kits utilize the same core primer sequences found in the Identifiler series and NGM Select kits. For TPOX, we have had to relocate that locus into the higher size range to ensure that we could fit everything into the multiplex effectively. But for that locus and for the DYS391 locus, which we've also had to move into a slightly higher size range compared to the YFiler kit, we've only chosen to change one of the primers for each of those loci. Again, we achieved the relocation, but we maximize concordance by minimizing the changes to those primers. So the only primer we've changed for both of those loci is the reverse primer. This is the unlabeled primer. It's the easier primer to change out. It won't cause any more issues with artifacts, etc., because it is the unlabeled primer, and it means we can relocate those loci safely and also maximize concordance as much as we can. Of course, it's always important to perform a concordance study to double-check the effects of any changes, and in an initial population study of 1,000 samples, we found no discordance was observed in TPOX and DYS391, even with these slight changes to the primers. But concordance is not the only important aspect of genotyping. We also want to maximize the accuracy of our genotyping. And to do that, we need to reduce the levels of false homozygosity that we know have been reported with some of our chemistries and our existing primer sequences. There are numerous literature reports that indicate instances of null alleles with some of our other chemistries as a result of SNP mutations in the primer binding site region. So to address this for the GlobalFiler kits and maximize the accuracy of our calling, we've actually introduced 8 new SNP-specific primers into the GlobalFiler kits, which will help to minimize the occurrence of null alleles in future data sets. The table on the right-hand side of your screen shows the loci for which we have introduced those new primers. And actually some of these loci, for example VWA, already have SNP-specific primers included since the early days of those primer developments based on mutations that were known at the time. These new primers are in addition to those and will help to accommodate the mutations that have been reported since our primer sequences were originally developed. So we have managed to incorporate all of the loci listed by the CODIS Core Loci Working Group and the other international bodies as required and highly recommended. Of course, that includes the required loci of the European standard set. And through the use of these same core primer sequences, we have maximized concordance with those established databases and all of those previous analyzed samples by maintaining wherever we could the current identifier series and NGM Select primer sequences. So let's move on and take a look at the additional Y marker, because this has been a cause of query and questions for the laboratories that we've spoken to. And so probably the real question is, well, why include a Y? Well, we do know from the extensive population studies that have been conducted that amylogenin Y null alleles do occur. And when this is the case, the laboratory generally does need to confirm the gender of that sample, and so additional Y testing may be required to confirm the sample gender. Now, obviously, additional testing, any form of additional testing, be it a repeat or be it an additional test to accommodate for an inconsistency with the original result, decreases the efficiency of the laboratory and forces samples to go back around the system. And if we can minimize that, then obviously that would be all to the good. Now, amylogenin is located on the short arm of the Y chromosome. Any additional gender identification markers that we decided to incorporate, we decided to put on the long arm of the Y chromosome, because that minimizes the risk of a double deletion, knocking out both amylogenin and the additional markers incorporated to add redundancy for the gender determination. So the DYS391 locus is on the long arm of the Y chromosome, so that's in a good spot. But we've also decided to incorporate an additional gender determining marker, the Y indel, which I'll talk a little bit about in a moment, which gives us additional redundancy for the gender determination. Now, there are a lot of YSTR loci to choose from, so why was DYS391 chosen for this particular purpose? Bearing in mind it's designed to be a gender determination redundant marker for amylogenin. Well, based on the information on the Y haplotype reference database, 50% of haplotypes on that database show allele 10 for DYS391, and only 2 null alleles have been reported in all of the data that's on that database. There have only been 0.01% duplication events in over 700 different worldwide population groups, and therefore we know that this locus is very stable. With a relatively narrow allele range, it isn't going to mutate significantly, and that means it's going to be a nice, stable locus to act as a gender determination backup to amylogenin. But what about the indel, and why have we decided to put one of these into the system? Well, for those of you that aren't familiar with them, indels are simply short-length polymorphisms, consisting of either the presence, an insertion, or the absence, a deletion, of a particular short sequence of nucleotides. And that sequence of nucleotides is somewhere generally between about 1 and 50 bases. Now, we decided to take a 5 base pair indel on the long arm of the Y chromosome, and you can see the 2 forms of that in this image here. On the left-hand side is allele 1 with the deletion, and on the right-hand side is allele 2, which is 5 bases longer because it contains the insertion. And so if you look at what a male sample would look like, you can see that obviously there's amylogenin with the Y peak highlighted here. DYS391 is in the higher molecular weight range of the green dye to make sure that we have that redundancy and to space out the loci as effectively as we can. But given that this locus is in the high size range, we knew that in degraded samples that makes it vulnerable to drop out, and if your redundant marker is dropping out, then suddenly you don't have that additional gender determination backup for amylogenin in degraded samples. So that's why we chose to put the Y indel in this lower molecular weight region of the profile, even smaller than amylogenin. So it isn't vulnerable to anything other than very, very extreme degradation of the sample. And it means that you now have triple redundancy for the gender determination of the sample. We also chose to put them all in the green dye so that it's very easy to see at a glance that you have the confirmation gender of your sample. So we have incorporated the Y marker. Now, incorporating all of these loci is a challenge in itself, but to maintain the size range that we currently have for all of these amplicons of less than 460 bases is a very big goal for this system, to make sure that we don't compromise the performance of a more complex multiplex on degraded DNA samples in particular. So let's take a look at the actual configuration now that we've spoken quite a bit about all those primers. It has been made a little bit easier on us because of the maintenance of our primer sequences historically. Most of these loci fitted in very nicely into this configuration with a minimum of manipulation required. We did have to utilize mobility modifiers, as you might expect, and you can see for the grey boxes on this slide, the loci which have had the mobility modifiers applied. And you can see the grey box shows where the original amplicon length is, and the coloured box above it shows the actual electrophoretic mobility on the CE platform. You'll see that even some of our very short markers have had mobility modifiers applied to them, and the reason for this is to make sure that the very short amplicons do not suffer any interference from artifacts that might feed off the primer flare in the very low level of the profile, and also ensure that the size standard range extends down below the system and we can genotype all of these loci accurately. One of the real advantages of this configuration is the number of STR markers that we have under 220 bases. Now, why is 220 bases important? Well, it's round about that size that we really start to see a drop-off in degraded samples. Loci longer than 220 bases or thereabouts will start to drop out under degraded sample situations. And what we need to do is ensure that we're maximizing the information recovery even on the most degraded samples. And when you look at the discrimination power of these 10 loci, which are entirely below 220. There are some additional loci that span that particular size range, but these 10 are completely below that level. We have a probability of identity based on some preliminary calculations of about 9.2 times 10 to the minus 12. Now, that's quite a significant figure, because when you look at the discrimination power of the minifiler kit, which was our original multiplex system designed specifically for degraded DNA samples, the loci in the orange boxes are the loci which are shortened in the minifiler kit, and the probability of identity of that system is 1.05 times 10 to the minus 10. Now, if you had a sample that you knew was going to be extremely degraded and you only had a choice of one amplification because you had insufficient material for multiple STR amps, you'd probably have to make a choice as to whether you went for your frontline, larger multiplex system, or whether you chose to go for the minifiler kit to maximize your chances of at least getting some information out of your system. Because the GlobalFiler kit has such a high discrimination power in the low molecular weight range of the system, it now means you don't have to make a choice. Your frontline system for the rest of your samples can now also be your frontline system for degraded DNA samples, giving you that information recovery the first time you amplify that sample. But that by no means makes the minifiler kit redundant. In fact, if you have the opportunity to perform more than one amplification on your degraded sample, the long loci in the GlobalFiler kit are also still most of the long loci in the GlobalFiler kit, because we've maintained the primer sequences, and therefore if you add the two together, the mini STR combination of this system as a whole, when you add in the minifiler kit, gives you a probability of identity of approximately 5 times 10 to the minus 21. Now that is in the same region as the NGM Select kit in its entirety, and that is the most discriminating multiplex we've had up until the development of the GlobalFiler kit. This is a massive amount of information that you'll be able to recover from those degraded samples. It will minimize the number of partial profiles that you have to deal with. It will minimize the number of partial profiles on international databases, and thereby criminal intelligence searches to single source reference samples will come back with far fewer adventitious hits than was previously the case, and that should significantly improve the utility of international databases for criminal intelligence purposes. So we have managed to maintain that overall current amplicon size of less than 460. Even SE33 does not extend above that level, not only making the configuration very powerful in the face of difficult DNA samples, but it also makes it very simple to genotype, because we're not getting up into the very, very high ranges where sometimes allele calling can become more of a challenge. Now, since many of our earlier systems were developed, we have identified additional alleles, and therefore the allelic ladders in some of our early systems do not incorporate all of the current alleles that are on reported databases. And this may mean additional manual editing requirements for some laboratories if an allele that they encounter frequently is not within the ladder and is not genotypable based on that ladder, we need to run extra tests in order to confirm it. To expand the allelic ladders would mean a reduction in the number of additional runs needed to confirm the identity of an off-ladder allele and also maximize the efficiency of genotyping. So these are just two examples of the ladders which have been expanded in the GlobalFiler kit. The D13 ladder has been extended to both the bottom and the top compared to the identifier ladder, and the D19 ladder has been extended compared to the NGM Select kit range, again at both the bottom and the top, significantly increasing the number of alleles that can be genotyped. So those are just two examples. We've actually added 31 alleles to 9 of the GlobalFiler kit marker ladders to give the ladder that you see on your screen now. This is by far the most complex allelic ladder that we've ever designed. It has the widest marker ranges of any of the systems that we have. And in addition to that, we've also added new virtual bins to the GeneMapper IDX and GeneMapper ID analysis files to be able to ensure genotyping efficiency. So what you'll be able to see is you can genotype up to nearly 600 alleles using this allelic ladder. And when you combine that with the efficiencies of GeneMapper IDX as an expert system, that's a huge efficiency gain for the laboratory and far fewer repeats when you put that system together. So we have managed to incorporate additional alleles into the allelic ladder. And we've seen the configuration, we've taken a look at the system as a whole. I think now it's time to look at the data that we've been obtaining with some of the early versions of our system. This is an example of the sensitivity of the GlobalFiler kit, because I know that many laboratories have had some adjustments to make with the increased sensitivity of some of our next generation systems, in that samples that may not have given a result do now give a result, which is obviously of a benefit. But samples which were already a mixture potentially of 2 individuals may now come up as a mixture of 3 or more individuals, which can make the interpretation somewhat more complex. So for the GlobalFiler kits, to make sure that they can take advantage of the developments that laboratories made and their ability to handle these more complex types of samples, but not make the interpretation any more difficult than it needs to be, we've actually maintained the level of sensitivity of the GlobalFiler kits with our next generation systems such as Identifiler Plus and the NGM Select kit. So what you can see here is going down the dilution scale of a variety of different concentrations of DNA. What you'll be able to see are that we've got comparable sensitivity between the two systems. So we've maintained that sensitivity. We have not compromised the sensitivity just because the multiplex has got larger, but we haven't increased the sensitivity either, making it more difficult to interpret. But even though they share the same levels of sensitivity, when you look at the amount of information you can get back from a GlobalFiler profile because of the increased number of loci, you'll see that the number of alleles recovered, even at those very low concentrations, does increase. And what this means is you will be able to get more information out of that system without the need to step up the sensitivity, which might give you some challenges from an interpretation point of view. One thing we have improved is the inhibitor tolerance of the system. Now, our next generation systems, such as the NGM Select and Identifiler Plus kit, were significantly better at overcoming inhibition than some of our earlier generation kits like SGM Plus, Profiler Plus, and Identifiler. But what we've been able to do through further optimization of the buffer system is to improve that inhibitor tolerance still further. And you can see humic acid inhibition on the left and hematin inhibition on the right. And throughout, you'll see that the GlobalFiler kit maintains its performance even in the presence of very high levels of inhibitor concentration. And this is final concentration in the reaction, not the stock concentration that then gets diluted into the reaction itself. You can see very good levels of recovery. So this chemistry will be even better than the rest of our next generation systems at overcoming inhibition and delivering the results that you want to see. So these are some examples from the prototype version of the system, which was what we would call our alpha version of the chemistry. We're now much further down the development route than you see here. So this is effectively going to be the worst case scenario that you'll see of GlobalFiler kit performance, and we believe we've enhanced the performance of the system even further from what you see here from these early results from our test sites. On the left-hand side, you can see an Identifiler kit profile of a swab taken from a T-shirt and extracted using the organic method. no profile whatsoever was obtained, whereas on the right-hand side, the GlobalFiler Kit was able to deliver a full profile with 39 alleles. That's far more probative information to the laboratory. But you would expect that kind of improvement in performance over a previous generation system such as Identifiler, but how does it stack up against our next generation system? Well, we have the Identifiler Plus Kit analysis of a bone sample on the left-hand side and the GlobalFiler Kit on the right-hand side. And this is where we see the real power of those mini STR loci concentrated in the low molecular weight range of the GlobalFiler system. We get a decent profile using the Identifiler Plus Kit, and we get 21 alleles, but because of the packed nature of the smaller size range of the GlobalFiler Kit, we've been able to get 7 more alleles, so 28 alleles from this system, really giving us that additional information to minimize the number of matches we might potentially get to our database if we were searching for a potential suspect for this sample. What we've also got here is the NGM Selects kit on the left-hand side, and this is an example of how the inhibitor tolerance has been improved. We've only managed to accumulate 18 alleles from this particular extraction of a cigarette butt, whereas on the right-hand side we have a really nice full profile with the GlobalFiler kit of 43 alleles. Again, a significant improvement on the amount of information that we're able to get. So that's performance on casework type samples. What about the performance that we're able to get on the single source samples through the direct amplification workflow? And these are just examples of the GlobalFiler Express kit, the single source version of the GlobalFiler kit, for blood on FTA card, buccal on a Bode buccal collector, and also buccal on a Copan flock swab. And what you can see here are very nicely balanced, good signal intensity, very clean baseline profiles, all from unpurified samples, either directly, as in the case of FTA card, which lyses the sample on contact, or for the Bode buccal and swab substrate in combination with the prep and go buffer. We get very high quality results against all of the common substrates utilized for single source analysis, and this should enable laboratories to simply implement this type of workflow into the laboratory and be confident that the quality of the results is not only going to be easy to interpret if you were using a manual regime, but particularly efficient if you're going to be using an expert system, because the cleaner and better quality those profiles, the easier it will be to program an expert system to analyze the majority of that data for you. And whilst performance is obviously key, particularly for the casework sample, there's nothing to say that we cannot try and optimize throughput as much as we can, not just for the single source samples through the direct amplification process, but also for casework samples. If we can reduce the amplification time without compromising the performance, then why should we not provide those time savings to the laboratory? And this is just to show you one of the tools that we use to try and understand whether reducing throughput and amplification time is possible with the chemistries that we're looking at. What we have here are contour plots of 2 of the dyes in the system, FAM on the top and NED on the bottom. And what we're looking at is a combination of the effect of extension time and annealing time on the balance within a color within that profile. So basically, the greener the plot, the better the balance within the profile. So essentially where we need to be is in the dark green areas. But what you can see is the dark green area for the FAM dye is in a very different part of the plot to the dark green area for the NED dye. So it's always a case of balancing the performance of all of those different attributes of the chemistry, the thermal cycling parameters, as well as all the reaction components, and through a comprehensive multi-phased analysis of all of those different parameters, we can come up with what we believe is the optimum reaction speed and profile quality combination for both the direct amplification system and the casework kit, with no profile quality compromise necessary. And so through doing that process, these are the thermal cycling conditions that have been determined. So for the GlobalFiler Express kit on the left-hand side, the cycle number will need to be determined by the individual laboratories to match the sensitivity of their instrument and sample types with the chemistry itself. That's a very simple study that needs to be done as part of a validation study. And you can see we have a 2-step PCR process which enables us to get through those applications as quickly as we can. For the GlobalFiler kit, we've optimized for a 29-cycle protocol only. We believe this gives us the best combination of profile quality and sensitivity, Again, it's a two-step PCR, but with slightly longer holds to allow the primers to seat themselves down properly on that template, particularly in a background of difficult levels of inhibitors and challenge samples, and make sure the reaction has more than enough time to complete. But even by doing so, we managed to get the total amplification time for the GlobalFiler Express kit down to approximately 40 minutes. And for the GlobalFiler kit for casework, we're down to under an hour and a half. We're at approximately an hour and 20 minutes. So significant savings for the single amplification workflow, even when you compare it to our latest system, the NGM Select Express kit, which was 45 minutes. Additional optimizations shaved another 5 minutes off that time, and we can now save over an hour on the standard casework amplification time of Identifiler Plus and NGM Select for the GlobalFiler kit. So we have got the performance, but we've also managed to shave a few more efficiency savings into that process as well. So we've optimized our buffer systems to maximize performance for both single source samples in the Express kit and for casework samples in the standard GlobalFiler kit. And we've managed to shave some additional time savings in the thermal cycling conditions also. But what about the platforms on which these systems can run? Well, we know many laboratories have either the 9700 with silver or gold-plated silver 96-well blocks, because those are the blocks that have been traditionally validated with our chemistries, but also the Verity thermal cycler is now supported for use with all of our AmpliStar kit products, and therefore what we've done is develop the chemistry on the Verity and verify the chemistry on the 9700, so either of these platforms is perfectly acceptable. The 3500 series genetic analyzers were designed to cope with 6-die chemistry right from their design. It was always important to build the additional die capability into the instrument platform because it is more difficult to engineer an instrument to do something new than it is to engineer chemistry. Chemistry developments tend to happen much faster. So it was important to enable the 3500 with 6-die capability in preparation for when the chemistry would catch up. And so for the laboratories that have a 3500 already, they are fit and ready to go to analyze 6-die data. But that doesn't mean that we've ignored the other platforms that we know laboratories have out there. So we have enabled 6-die capability on the 3130 series and the 3730 genetic analyzer. Just a small note, the 3730 genetic analyzer is currently only validated for the Identifiler kit for single source samples, and it's only on the 48 CAT instrument, not the 96. This is the same now for the GlobalFiler Express kit, so it's only the GlobalFiler Express kit which has been validated on the 3730 platform. We do not support the analysis of the GlobalFiler kit for casework on that instrument platform. But for the 3130 series and 3500 series genetic analyzers, both GlobalFiler kits will be supported on these platforms. And we have made some changes to the GeneMapper IDX software to enable it to better support the GlobalFiler kit specific configuration. Any laboratory who has version 1.2 or above of GeneMapper IDX software can very easily analyze 6-die data already, but there are 1 or 2 additional sophistications which have been introduced into the GeneMapper IDX software version 1.4 to make the GlobalFiler data analysis specifically just that little bit more effective. Obviously, to calibrate the instrument for 6 dyes, you will need a new matrix standard. So this is the DS36 or J6 matrix standard set, very similar to the matrix standard sets you've seen from us before, just simply the addition of the new dyes within the system. And this is the data quality that we're seeing on the 3500 compared to the 3130 series platforms once they've been enabled for 6-die analysis. We had to make a couple of changes to the variable binning settings for the 3130 series instruments just to gain optimal color balance, but you can see that the data looks very, very similar, and you can expect to see very similar data on both of those platforms. For the 3730, we didn't actually have to make any changes whatsoever, and you can see comparable data quality on both platforms. So this is just a look at one of the changes within the GeneMapper IDX software version 1.4. Although we know that the previous versions 1.2 and 1.3 can perform 6-die analysis already, there are some slight additional changes that we needed to make to enable the software to handle GlobalFiler specifically, and particularly the combination of autosomal and haplotype markers within the same system. So additional 6-die functionality and mixture interpretation capability has been added to the system. We've updated a lot of the specific analysis files within the system, such as the panels, bins, and stutter ratios, some of the table and plot settings to accommodate the wider range of the system compared to the identifier kit, for example, new size standard definitions to support the chemistry. A new population database will be made available online once the kit is released and our population studies have been completed. And also, the CODIS marker properties file has been updated to include all of the new loci within the system. We've also taken the opportunity to add a sample spike detection switch within the software. This is something that has been asked for by laboratories over the last few months, and what it allows the user to do is switch off the spike detection algorithm for the software. Occasionally, some laboratories who get very, very strong resolution have identified some samples that label a sample allele as a spike, and obviously it's not possible to revert that to calling it an allele. So just as we've already got a switch for the allelic ladder spike where laboratories can disable that, we've also now enabled them to disable the spike for the samples themselves. Not required for GlobalFiler Kit analysis, but coming up on the horizon very shortly, so I'll cover this at the same time, is the 3500 data collection software version 2. Now, the main reason for releasing this new version of data collection are the changes to the RFID limits within the software, which we're changing in some circumstances from a hard stop to a warning to allow the user to override them in certain circumstances. Now, you do not require data collection software version 2 to run the GlobalFiler Kit data. You can run it perfectly happily with the version 1 software that was installed with your instrument originally. However, we have updated certain things about the software, including some of the GlobalFiler specific assay templates, etc., within the data collection software version 2. So there are some benefits to GlobalFiler users with this software. But of course, it really is the RFID limits that are changing, that we've been asked to make these changes by laboratories wishing to have slightly more flexibility on the platform. So these are the software checks that have changed. For polymer, previously, if the polymer had expired either whilst it was on the instrument or had expired in the fridge before you put it on the instrument, this was a hard stop and it would not actually allow you to run the instrument with expired polymer. That has been changed to a warning. More than 7 days on the instrument was a warning, and that remains a warning. Now, obviously, we don't recommend laboratories to utilize expired reagents because for operational reasons, validating with in-date reagents gives you the best quality data, but we do appreciate that if laboratories do have reagents left over, either from a large order and they wish to use it for training or for research purposes, then obviously it does allow them to have just that little bit more flexibility. For the two different buffers, the expiration date, similar to the polymer, has been changed from a hard stop to a warning, but more than 7 days on the instrument remains a hard stop, and this is because by the time the buffer has been on instrument for 7 days, it will have exhausted, and it will start to cause problems with the run. Particularly, you may start to experience arcing, which can cause significant damage to the polymer blocks on the instrument, and that becomes very expensive to fix, so we're not changing that to a warning. We obviously produce reagent and consumable lifetime minimum performance guarantees, and those are designed to promote the production of high-quality data and minimize downtime across many different laboratory environments, bearing in mind that some instruments may be in very cold environments, other instruments may be in very warm environments, and we have published information on why we made the original decision to introduce these limits in the first place. So, of course, we would advise caution to laboratories wishing to go beyond these limits, but we do appreciate that some additional flexibility may be required. For laboratories on a 3500, it's a very easy fit to adopt the GlobalFiler Kit. It simply will run on the platforms that you have available already, and with a couple of small upgrades, you can also get the new data collection software and the new GeneMapper IDX software, and everything is then at top efficiency. For the 3130 instrument, obviously there are a few more pieces and components to that update to enable that instrument to run the GlobalFiler system. And so to try and make it easy, we've combined all of the components within a single package. The chemistry, so the kit, the matrix standard, and the size standard if necessary. Also in terms of consumables, the polymer and, if necessary, the array. A new computer will be required for the Windows 7 operating system, which also comes with the new versions of software. The 6-die data collection and also GeneMapper IDX version 1.4, together with training and support, so service engineer support to actually help get the software in the first place, and then a 6-die verification by a support specialist to enable your instrument to be up and running and you to be comfortable and confident with the quality of the 6-die data you'll be able to get onto your instrument. We often get asked just what are the cost implications of such an upgrade. Well, we're aiming for this to be somewhere in the region of the same cost of upgrading a 3100 to a 3130 in and around the same type of region as that. But obviously, please have a discussion with your local HID or sales representative, and they'll be able to provide much more information on this process. So that's our checklist completed. We've managed to create the 2 kits that we feel are the best way to generate the performance and efficiency requirements of the laboratory. We've managed to incorporate all of the loci that are commonly used on international databases, the different types of markers that are needed, making sure that it's really powerful on degraded samples, and demonstrating unprecedented levels of performance, particularly on inhibited samples. So where does that leave us in terms of the overall discrimination power of such a system? And if we look back at the levels of discrimination possible with the IdentiFiler and NGM Select kits, so the 2 largest kits we've produced to date, you can see that IdentiFiler generally comes in the region of a probability of identity in the region of 5 times 10 to the minus 18. NGM Select is a little bit more discriminating than that, but when you add all of those loci together, based on preliminary calculations for a US Caucasian database, we get a probability of identity for GlobalFiler of 7 times 10 to the minus 26. This is by far the greatest level of discrimination we've been able to produce for the systems, and all of those loci are on that CODIS recommended or required list, meaning that that level of discrimination is what you will get from the loci you would be potentially required to process. There are no loci wasted within the system. This really is going to enable you to reduce the risk of adventitious matches, make the most of the data within your system, and facilitate those international DNA profile comparisons. So this is a big step up in terms of discrimination, and obviously this is based on a US Caucasian database. When we look at some of the African descent databases, we would anticipate those numbers to be higher still. So I think now that we've gone through the kit as a whole, we've gone through the design decisions that we've taken, we've gone through some of the performance capabilities, I think it's good to look back at some of those questions and concerns that we received when we first started talking about building this system and see if we've managed to address those. I think we've demonstrated that we haven't compromised the sensitivity and we haven't increased the risk of partial profiles simply by increasing the number of loci. We've balanced the increase in the number of loci by an improvement in the overall capabilities of the system, so we've maintained or improved the next generation levels of performance laboratories have come to expect. For trace, low-level and touch-type samples, we haven't made these any more complicated. So the sensitivity levels are very much in line with the original sensitivity of some of our other next-generation systems, so that we won't be creating even more complex mixtures that laboratories simply can't analyze. But we will maximize information recovery through the small markers contained within the system and through the enhanced robustness. So hopefully, even for the mixtures that are difficult to interpret right now, we will be able to make them just that little bit easier. The additional Y marker is very useful as a gender determination redundancy for amylogenin, just in case an allele amylogenin does crop up, but we've also incorporated that Y indel in the very low molecular weight range to compensate for the potential dropout of the DYS391 marker in the high molecular weight size range, and making sure that we've always got redundancy for amylogenin, thus hopefully considerably reducing the need for additional testing for gender determination. And we are cognizant of the fact that laboratories do not have a lot of money to throw at new kit implementation processes, particularly whereas many labs may have implemented a new system only in the space of the last 2 to 3 years as our next generation chemistries have come on stream. So to try and address some of this, we have enabled the running of 6 dyes on some of our older platforms to make it a little bit easier for laboratories to potentially adopt what is a very powerful system that may give them huge benefits in terms of the data they're able to obtain, but without the requirement to upgrade to a new comprehensive CE platform. So what do we hope that this chemistry will enable you to do in the laboratory? And I hope what I'm going to share with you now really does help to indicate why we've made some of the decisions that we have for the development of this kit. We would like to help you go faster. Now, although speed is not the be-all and end-all for some laboratories, shaving off time where personnel can be doing something else or more batches can be going through the laboratory, particularly for high-throughput laboratories, this is something which can be a real benefit. And so compared to some of our older systems, we can get up to 5 times faster amplification than some of those previous kits, with GlobalFiler Express coming in at 40 minutes and GlobalFiler at 80 minutes. We want you to be able to go further with the data that you're able to get. The 24 loci is a large number, but with those 10 mini STRs, enabling you to get more information from those degraded samples and putting everything together can give you up to 9 orders of magnitude more discrimination power dependent upon the population group that you're looking at. That's a huge step up in terms of discrimination for all of the forensically relevant loci contained within the system. And on top of that, we've been able to develop an enhanced buffer system for even better performance on inhibited samples, again, allowing you to bring back more information from each sample and reduce the number of partial profiles you may have to deal with. And ultimately, if this is what your laboratory wishes to do, it will enable laboratories to share their data globally. By utilizing all of the loci on international databases and that are contained in international Loci Recommendation sets, we maximize global database compatibility, not just with the data that's going to be generated in future, but also with the data that's been generated in the past, because through the maintenance of all our primer sequences, we're going to be able to maximize the levels of consistency and concordance with all of those profiles, both past and future. So with that, I would like to say thank you very much for your attention during this webinar session. I hope you found the information useful. And if you do have any questions regarding the GlobalFiler Kits or any other Life Technologies product, then please contact your local Life Technologies HID specialist. Thank you very much and goodbye.